introduce you to Podge. Podge was a convinced atheist. He was quite happy to be apart from God and to be against God. He lives in the west of Ireland now, and he grew up there as well. He was brought up in the Catholic faith. In his teenage years, though, he began to question that. And he loved a good argument. The priest used to come into school to teach them, and Podge used to say to him, "Where is this God of yours? Bring him out so we can see him. I don't have any evidence for him." So he was very bold. He used to harass him. He regrets it now, but for a little while back then, when he was at school, he was a bit of a hero because the priest actually gave up coming to the school because he was giving him such a hard time. But then some of his friends began to find Jesus in a different way, in a way that was personal and real to them. And they were very convinced by this change. And it made a big difference to them. It gave them real joy and meaning. But Podge loved a good argument. So he loved to argue with them. And they were giving him books to read, and they were inviting him to Bible studies, but he loved to argue. And then they had a study in Romans chapter 1, which there's a few verses there. It speaks of how God makes himself known plainly in creation, so that people have no excuse, and yet they suppress the truth by their wickedness. And Podge was so sure of himself, he argued he was the living proof that the Bible isn't true because he didn't believe in God. And yet, beneath all that talk, those words cut, and he knew that they were true. And yet he was resisting God and pushing him out. Until one weekend he was away with friends, and one of his friends at the end of the night said he would pray for him. And Podge kind of said, just turn the lights off, let me get some sleep. He was, what he said, had a hard face right up to the end, because when the lights went off, he felt the Spirit, God's Spirit prompting him to do what he knew he should do and to surrender his life. And he did. And his life has changed. He no longer lives apart from God and against him, but he says he walks with the God who is the creator of the world, and he has found a new meaning and purpose, a joy and a peace, an assurance that comes not from what he has done, but what Jesus did for him. Podge is not who he was. Living apart from God, living against God, isn't a particular thing to Podge, you know. According to the Bible, that's true of all of us in some way. Not all in the same way, but in some way we set out against God because of our fallen human nature. When you look at some people, and maybe you're one of these people, it might look like you just don't care about God. You're indifferent towards him. Or some other people might be very religious and they're keeping rules, and it looks as if they're walking towards God. But it's possible to be doing both of those things and still to be doing it on your own terms. Still to be the one in control, still to be apart from God. This is a different view of humanity, isn't it, to one which many share today, which is that human beings are just basically all good at heart, aren't we? We're all decent at the core. It might surprise you to know that the Bible is quite confronting on this. Pretty honest. It allows us to be real and to say, well, no, we're not all good all the time. Far from it. And in fact, it's really important as Christians that we remember what we once were and also who has made the difference. Because otherwise we cheapen God's grace. Cheapen God to just, God's tidied us up a little bit. Or God's just put a little bit of polish on our lives. God's helped us along the way. But God has made the decisive and dramatic rescue. The lesser our view of his grace, the less reason we have for continuing with him. So Paul, as he writes to the Colossians here in this verse in chapter 1, reminds them who they were. It's really important to remember who we once were. Verse 21, once you were alienated from God, you were enemies in your minds because of your evil behaviour. They were estranged from God. That word also means estranged, which is used in Ephesians, where Paul writes this in chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. Remember, at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, his people, foreigners to the covenants of promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. In Ephesians, Paul is addressing those who come from a Gentile background, and he's saying that you didn't have any part in God's promises back then, you were distant from him. And some of this church he's writing to here in Colossae are the same. They've come from that Gentile background. But when we read through the Gospels and the New Testament, we know that being from a Jewish background, whilst it had some privileges to it, it was no guarantee of being close to God. The very hostility and animosity and religious zeal that saw Jesus crucified was by teachers of the law, leaders of the faith. But Paul says to them, you were hostile because your minds or your thinking was opposed to God, and this is evident in your behaviour. Thinking and behaviour belong together, don't they? It's what Paul has been saying in this letter so far. In chapter 1, verse 7, he talks about the process of growth in the gospel. That there's a learning in receiving the gospel. It changes our minds. And then he prays for growth in the gospel in verses 9 and 10. And he prays that they might know God, they might know his will, and that might change how they live their lives. But it's also shown in the poem, which points to the person of Christ in verses 15 to 20, which is really a great hymn or a creed that is set to show us what we believe about Jesus then works its way out in our lives. Yet these are all the positives. What Paul's reminding him here is of the negative. That left to our own selves, without God's intervention, we are against him. And it works out in our lives in evil deeds. And if we have any hope of being rescued and being brought back, well, it needs to be God's doing and not ours. We need to have our minds changed. The kids have been singing to us that we're a good news family today. They've been reminding us of that, and this is truly good news. The life of Christ in which we share as Christians, in which we are involved, is only possible because of the difference he has made. He has made us part of his body. And in this there is rest and relief today. The most decisive change needed in your life, you do not, and indeed you cannot make yourself. It's not a matter of you doing better, changing your life around, of you making something of yourself. We've got so many gospels with a small g out there today, offers of good news, rival stories of truth that promise hope but don't deliver. Rather, the good news of Jesus is what Proverbs 25:25 describes as good news from a far-off country, which refreshes our thirsty soul like cold water. It's news we could have never dreamt up. It's a rescue that we couldn't do ourselves. It's refreshing. So someone like Podge now knows joy and peace and walking with God and not warring with him. Let me tell you another story of Matthias. He needed a bit more help to receive this good news. He's originally from Brazil but living in Ireland. Semi-finalist on The Voice of Ireland, actually. He could sing with freedom and be appreciated. And he said it was something that his soul needed. When he was growing up as a child at 5 years old, he suffered at the hands of a family member in a way that left him feeling ashamed. Kept him distant in relationships in his life. And though his family went to church, it made him angry with God. What kind of God would do this to me? Is he punishing me for something I've done wrong? But when he moved to Ireland, he was involved in a church, and he was sitting down at the back. He was singing quietly to himself. And after, the pastor's wife came to him and said, "I heard you sing." And he was like, "No way you heard me sing." I was just whispering at the back. But she was like, I heard your spirit sing. And she took him, and she kind of recognized he had a gift for singing, and she gave him confidence and coaching in piano and voice. She brought him out of himself in a way that he was seen and heard, in a way that he allowed himself to be loved. And he says this: he let go of the past, of what had happened, of the hatred, and he warmed and became more open to receiving love, to recognizing how Jesus had died to take away his sin, past, present, and future, how he could give the shame and guilt over to him and know a new freedom. And he says this, he says, God doesn't put guilt or shame on us. He loves us as sons and daughters. He'd laid down what was too heavy to carry, what was making him angry with God. Now he had received his love. This is how the death of Jesus and the good news of his reconciliation, his bringing us back to him, worked its way out in the story of Matthias' life. And again, we don't all share that same shape of the story as Matthias. But the Bible does tell us that we all need to be brought back, that we all begin far off from God. And it tells us that the dramatic and decisive change that God makes is pictured as reconciliation, that once we were enemies, now we're friends. Once we were at war with God, now we're at peace with God. Once we were estranged, now we're part of the family. There's been this great restoration of relationship. And this is just what Paul reminds the Colossians of. Once you were this, now you are. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. For those of us who were here last week, you'll remember the heights of that profound Christ hymn. But it spoke of reconciliation. Verse 19 in the chapter, God was pleased to have his fullness dwell in Jesus, in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth, or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. All things reconciled in Jesus. But now he straightens up and he steps in. He says he has reconciled you. He also makes this present. What will come in the end is the reconciliation of all things has been made present in this community of faith. To echo last week, here is a bunch of believers who look very small, who look sidelined in terms of the order of the day. They didn't look up to much. But here is where God is working out his grand and great purposes. Here, if you look at what he's doing in this bunch of people, is what he will do in the whole of creation come at the end. Reconciled in a way that is a foretaste and a trailer of how things will be in the end. Granted, it takes a bit of living out. We'll get there. Chapter 3, verse 15 says this: "Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since, as members of one body, you were called to peace, and be thankful." That takes a bit of living out, that verse. But it's a reality. God has reconciled us. The Message version says this: "You yourselves are a case study of what God does." It's like God has taken us and he's made an example of us for good. And this reality of reconciliation is because of the death of Jesus. The phrase there, you may have heard it, sounded a little clumsy. Through Christ's physical body, through death. The Greek means literally the body of flesh. And Paul is deliberately using these words to show that Jesus was flesh and blood like we are. He's addressing, teaching around the church at that time that spiritualizes Jesus, that strays away from his humanity. And when we do that, we lose the truth that Jesus, being fully man, identified with us, bore our sins fully on the cross. But also that Jesus, being fully God, lived a perfect life. And death couldn't hold him, but he rose. In this historical event, we are reconciled. So our relationship with God and our knowing him, it's not based on our doing. In fact, the last verse showed us, verse 21 showed us what our doing amounts to left to our own devices. It's evil behaviour, but God's doing is different. God's doing reconciles us through giving his Son for us. Nor is it based on how we feel subjectively. Even on the days when you feel discouraged, when you feel down, when you feel distant from God, we can still know the truth of the gospel. Jesus cannot be unrisen. He cannot be de-crucified. The matchless and perfect life he lived cannot be undone. We are reconciled to God by faith because of these objective things that have happened to this person. And it's from this we now live. To be reconciled is a warm word. It's a relational word. It means to know God. We have friendship and fellowship with him. I think that's something we can particularly warm to as a church family. We seek to extend a wide welcome and extend God's grace by being friendly and loving. And as we do that, we hope that people might encounter something in this environment that opens them up to God, just like Matthias. When someone loves him in a way that brings him out of himself. Or like Podge, if you think of how his friends impacted him. They continued to love him, even when he admitted himself he was hard work. He was arguing with them. To be reconciled is deeply personal as well. In another way, because there is a person who is himself God, who took on the softness of human flesh, that it might be torn, that he might bleed and die for us. He gave himself for us. And because of this, we read, here Paul says, we are holy and without blemish, free from accusation, looking forward to one day in the future when we will meet with God. And on that day, it will matter most what Jesus has done for us. That will be how we are received, because of what he has done. The language used is similar to that of a sacrifice in the Old Testament, whole and perfect, offered to God. So it could have that end in view, but it also calls to mind the kind of lives we're to live along the way. Giving ourselves to God. At the very start of the letter, you'll remember that the church were addressed as holy or set apart. But they're also addressed as faithful, people who continue to believe. Brian is believing. He's holding on to hope. Brian's a bit of a spiritual seeker. And we've been pressing into the promise God makes that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. It's a verse from Hebrews chapter 11, and he was pressing into this. He wanted with every part of his being to surrender to God and to enjoy that reward. And then in a very vivid way, he came to recognize what that reward was. The reward was that God was seeking him. He was seeking God, but actually the reward was to discover that God was seeking him. That God didn't just want to be loved, but God loved him. God wasn't just there to be known, but God knew him. And he says, nothing can take that love away. We can enjoy his presence then and continually seeking and knowing him. His journey had started sometime before this, and he become a Christian. He was into arts and music and alternative healing. He moved to Australia and was practicing alternative therapies. He came back to Ireland. He had his own shop where he was selling all kinds of spiritual things and spiritual books. But he says this: when it came to his own point of healing, who was going to heal the healer? He looked for answers in spiritual books of all types. But then he opened up a Bible which a friend gave him because he didn't sell the Bible in his shop. But when he opened up the Bible, he discovered some of the story of Jesus that invited him in. The story of treasure in a field that was found. And this brought a change about in him. A dramatic change that he continues to live out as he seeks God in faith. Brian, the creative, has come to know the stability of knowing God and being loved by his Creator. And he says that nothing can take this away from him. His faith is strong and it's sure, but it's not static. He's seeking after God. What Brian has discovered is the story that we have in the scriptures in which our search for God is framed within the greater search of God looking for us. Jesus, who in Luke 19 verse 10 says, he is the Son of Man who came to seek and save the lost. And it's from here that we can continue in faith and hold on to hope. C.S. Lewis famously speaks of his conversion to Christianity. He says this: amiable agnostics cheerfully talk about man's search for God. You maybe heard people talking about searching for God. Lewis says, to me as I then was, they might as well have talked about the mouse's search for the cat. You don't see many mice searching for cats, do you? But it's that idea that God is greater, God is bigger, God looks for us. So Paul has said to the Colossians, you were estranged once and now you are reconciled. And then verse 23, he says, if you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the hope you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. The very first word in this is a very small word, but it's a big tripping point. If. All that we've said is true. If. It might trouble us. It might shake us from our assurance of being reconciled by God. We can go into a spin here in our thinking. What about when I doubt? What about when I sin? What about when I let go of hope and I'm not firm? Does that mean I'm not genuine? When we do that, the cruel irony is we're going almost in exactly the opposite direction that Paul is writing in these verses. ESV Study Bible says that the form of this phrase in the Greek indicates that Paul expects the Colossians to continue. He's confident. Another Bible scholar has paraphrased it a little to, at any rate, if you stand firm in the faith, and I'm sure you will, that's more the tone of it. And that fits the context. You see, Paul says, remember what you were. Remember what God has done so that you know his grace in full measure behind your back. That's what keeps you going as a Christian. Remembering the change he has made keeps you continuing so that you can be firm in the faith. And that's the context of this letter too, because these Christians are being told that what they have isn't enough. You need something new teaching or a new spiritual experience to keep going. But Paul's saying, no, look at the decisive and dramatic change that was made when you first believed. Remember that and live out of that. Keep going. Verse 6, he says, they heard the gospel and understood God's grace. Back then, they're to keep going in it. But it does raise the question for us, what about the teaching that's sometimes called the perseverance of the saints, or the idea that once someone is saved, then they're always saved. Can they fall away? Well, it might help us to think of what God sees from his perspective and what we see from ours. N.T. Wright says this, speaking of this verse: from God's point of view, genuine faith is assured of continuing to the end. From the human point of view, we discover whether faith is genuine only by patient perseverance, only by being encouraged by Christian hope. Peter O'Brien says it like this: if it is true that saints will persevere to the end, then it is equally true that saints must persevere to the end. So in other words, it's seen in keeping going. We might say this: genuine faith endures and is faithful, but also genuine faith does not assume that we have arrived, that it's all done, that it's all finished, that we put the feet up, there's no more to it. Rather, it continues. It's built up on solid foundations. That's the language Paul uses here. Firm and established. Talks about foundations, really. It might recall to your mind Jesus' words in the Sermon of the Mount, where he talks about the wise man who built his house on the rock was the one who put into practice Jesus' words. So when storms in life come, there's a steadiness, a stability, not like the one who built the house on the sand. Genuine faith is continuing faith. It's seen in this letter, as we read, as growth and fruitfulness, which appeals to us, I think, so much. But it's also seen as gritty faithfulness, in standing firm and staying true. They're in the midst of a messed up, mixed up, swirling pool of ideas about who Jesus is. And it's not only circling around the church, but it gets mixed up with their idea of what Christianity is. So it seeps into it. And what Paul is saying to them is, you need to stay true. Don't drift off. For us today, there's so many changes in our culture when it comes to how people think of God. Many have left him behind. There's many different ideas of religion and spirituality out there which can get mixed up with us. Just before the summer, we had a series in Genesis on being human, and through that series we looked at some of the stories that are presented to us about what it is to be human in our world, that are offered to us as good news. We need to pay attention to these and be true to Jesus' story, to hold on to hope in the gospel. It's a joy to be part of this church family. It's a joy for each of us to be part of this church family. But actually, sometimes, and we've seen it with people in our church family, you might be here for a while, you might move on. The most important thing, key thing, is not that you're a member of this church family, but it is that you stay firm in faith. That you hold on to the hope of the gospel. Really, as Christians, we are a bit of a resistance movement. We hold on to Jesus despite what all the other messages around us say. We stay true. And amazingly, this continuing in faith connects to the hearing of the gospel through the whole of creation. Paul says that the gospel that you heard is being proclaimed to every creature under heaven. He's maybe echoing the Christ hymn that he has just been penning, that Lord of creation, Lord of new creation. But in verse 6, he's also said the gospel bears fruit in the whole world. And this gospel, Paul says, he's become a servant, just like Epaphras was a servant. And next week we will see how that service comes at a cost. But as we finish today, let me point to this. It's as we continue in our faith, we are being real to the change the gospel has made in us. And that steadfastness in Jesus commends him in a way that sees the gospel spread. As we are consistent, as we continue as Christians, we show the reality of Jesus in our lives. Life in Christ is not an abstract or theoretical creed or poem. It's personal and practical. He really changes people. People like Podge and Matthias and Brian. They shared their stories as a part of What's the Story in October 2022. What's the Story 22.ie. You can watch their stories. Next year, in March 2025, the next phase of What's the Story is Patrick's Story, focusing around Patrick's Day and exploring what it means to be Irish and Christian. And there'll be people sharing these stories again. But as we continue to be firm in the faith and to hold on to hope, might the sharing of our own stories as well see his good news spread? Maybe in other words, could it be as we root down in faith that there's a reaching out of the gospel as well?